1986, Chisholm, Minnesota. 38-year-old Nancy Jane Doherty, a mother of two, lived here. She assisted residents at Heritage Manor and served as a volunteer emergency medical technician in her spare time. Helping others was her calling, a dedication that eventually pushed her to pursue a higher professional path. She planned to move to Minneapolis to attend school and earn her certification as a paramedic. On the night of July 15, 1986, Nancy went out with her friend, Brian Evenson. Brian intended to help her move belongings into storage the next day after they enjoyed their final evening together. He dropped her home around 1 a.m. and returned to his residence, promising to see her in the morning. Following their schedule, Brian returned to Nancy's house on July 16, 1986, at approximately 8 a.m. Upon his arrival, he discovered the doors were bolted shut and every curtain remained tightly drawn. This seclusion was uncharacteristic for Nancy. He called out her name repeatedly, but the house remained silent. Assuming she was running errands before the move, he decided to return to the residence later that day. He visited several times as the hours passed, but the house remained as still and unchanged as before. Multiple phone calls went unanswered. Unable to establish contact, he finally summoned the police for a welfare check. Officers from the Chisholm Police Department forced entry into the apartment to investigate the woman's silence. They discovered Nancy's nude, lifeless body lying on her bed. The scene was immediately secured for investigation. Her remains were transported to the medical examiner's office where a post-mortem examination was conducted. Results confirmed that Nancy had been sexually assaulted and strangled, dying between 3 and 5 a.m. Evidence at the location suggested a violent struggle had occurred both inside and outside the home. Biological evidence and fingernail scrapings were recovered and uploaded to the National Criminal DNA Database for comparison. The search yielded no results. The killer remained a digital ghost without a name or a face. Investigators began questioning neighbors, hoping someone had witnessed the movements of a predator in the dark. They eventually located two girls from the neighborhood who had been walking near the house at 3 a.m. The girls told detectives that as they walked past the residence that morning, the silence was broken. From the sidewalk opposite the house, they heard rhythmic choking sounds but chose to continue on their way. They did not contact the authorities at the time, a decision that would lead to decades of deep regret. Police then narrowed their focus to Nancy's inner circle during the initial phases of the murder investigation. Suspicion fell on her estranged husband, Jim Doherty, as the couple was in the process of a divorce. Jim was cleared after investigators confirmed he was out of the country when the homicide took place. Over the years, DNA was collected from more than 100 individuals in a relentless search for the killer. Periodic case reviews were conducted as the decades passed, but no fresh leads or suspects ever materialized. Regular comparisons against the growing DNA database failed to produce a match for the biological evidence. Rewards totaling tens of thousands of dollars were offered, yet the silence of the community remained unbroken. The murder received significant media coverage, but every public appeal resulted only in frustrating dead ends. Investigators remained no closer to identifying a suspect than they were on the morning of the discovery. In early 2020, with the case long dormant, the Chisholm Police Department sought advanced technological assistance. They contacted a specialized genetic laboratory to request a re-examination of the decades-old biological evidence. The facility utilized public genealogy databases to help law enforcement generate leads in this cold case. Technicians coordinated with detectives to build a suspect's genetic profile from the evidence preserved since 1986. After an exhaustive search through genealogical records, their persistence finally led to a breakthrough. The investigation finally had a name for the alleged killer: Michael Carbo Jr. In 2020, 52-year-old Michael Carbo Jr. lived in Chisholm, less than a mile from the crime scene. At 17, he was a senior at the same high school attended by Nancy's own children. For over 30 years, Carbo lived within the community without ever appearing on the radar of law enforcement. To obtain conclusive evidence, detectives began surveilling his apartment at Lincoln Square, where he lived alone. They successfully recovered a discarded bag of trash belonging to the suspect to obtain a fresh DNA sample. A trash bag discarded at the residence held the answers. Inside were used tissues, a beer can, swabs, and towels containing Carbo's DNA. The genetic profile was found on every item. Forensic analysts compared this data against biological samples recovered from the scene of Nancy's homicide. The results confirmed a 100% match. This was the first instance where specialized DNA science was used within Minnesota to resolve a cold case. In July 2020, Michael Carbo Jr. was taken into custody at his home for Nancy Doherty's death. The trial began during early August of 2022 in St. Louis County Court. There, the prosecution detailed how Michael Carbo Jr. sexually assaulted and killed Nancy inside her own residence in 1986. Carbo admitted to sexual contact but claimed it was consensual, denying any part in her murder. His legal team attempted to suggest an alternative suspect. However, the state argued the homicide and the assault were inextricably linked. Furthermore, no probable evidence existed to suggest the presence of a different killer. On August 16, 2022, the 12-member jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on September 30, 2022. 36 years after the crime, Michael Carbo Jr. was sentenced to life for the first-degree murder of Nancy Doherty during a criminal sexual act. We now turn to Andrea Michelle Bowman, born June 23, 1974. Originally named Alexis Miranda Badger in New Orleans, she was surrendered and put up for adoption at 5 months old. Her teenage mother was unable to care for her, and her biological father was not interested in parenthood. In January 1975, the infant was moved to foster care. After months in a temporary placement, Alexis was adopted by Brenda and Dennis Bowman. She was only 21 months old at the time. Brenda worked as a retail clerk while Dennis was a veteran, recently discharged from the Navy. The pair had no other children of their own. They gave the toddler a new identity, Andrea Michelle Bowman. Once the adoption was finalized, they moved back to Michigan. Andrea would grow up as the only child of the Bowman household. As a young girl, she possessed a sweet and vibrant personality. She loved socializing and was passionate about playing the flute. Yet, the domestic reality she faced was far from the suburban perfect. The family earned a reputation for being strange among the neighbors. This social isolation resulted in Andrea being relentlessly mocked and bullied by her peers. Because the family moved constantly, she was forced to change schools multiple times. Consequently, she had few close friends. When she reached dating age, she had significant difficulty there as well. Local parents explicitly warned their sons to avoid her because of her family's odd reputation. But social rejection was not the most severe trauma Andrea faced. Both Dennis and Brenda mistreated her on a daily basis. The teenager often went hungry. In December 1987, Brenda gave birth to her biological daughter, Vanessa. Amidst the cycle of ongoing violence, this new life gave Andrea a sense of hope. Andrea immediately embraced her role as a protector for her newborn sibling. However, the parental abuse never stopped. At one point, she revealed the truth to a classmate. She spoke of wanting to leave home but needing to protect her little sister at any cost. By early 1989, a counselor learned the girl was terrified of returning home from school because of the domestic abuse. The authorities were finally contacted. After being questioned by police, Andrea came forward, accusing her adoptive father, Dennis, of sexual assault. A caseworker and police intervened. Investigators confronted both Dennis and Brenda regarding the abuse. The couple issued a total denial. They characterized the girl as rebellious. They claimed she was spiraling after learning of her infancy adoption. Police deferred to the parents' narrative. Andrea's desperate cries for help were dismissed as teenage angst. Officers instructed the victim to respect her family role. They prioritized domestic order over her safety. The Bowmans were advised to tighten their control to ensure such accusations never surfaced again. Following this systemic failure, the family relocated. They moved to a mobile home in Allegan County. March 11, 1989. Dennis phoned the Holland police station. He reported his 14-year-old daughter missing. He alleged she stole $100. Her supposed goal was finding her biological mother. The circumstances were highly suspicious. Regardless, police accepted the father's story and classified her as a runaway. With Andrea gone, the family uprooted once more. They moved to 136th Avenue in Michigan. Their new residence was located in Monterey Township. Months passed in the wake of the teenager's disappearance. Brenda reached out to the police repeatedly during this time. She claimed to have received tips about the girl. Reports placed a blonde, pregnant Andrea in various locations, yet every lead eventually evaporated. Without physical evidence to follow, the investigation circled back to the Bowmans multiple times. Dennis and Brenda initially played the part of cooperative parents. That facade soon crumbled. Silence replaced cooperation as the years passed. Detectives began noticing cracks in the narrative. Dennis's story was a shifting landscape. Small changes in his timeline signaled a deeper deception. Suspecting the father's involvement, the focus shifted. Investigators began excavating Dennis's history. The records revealed a predatory past. In 1980, Dennis had been intercepted by the law. He had forced an 18-year-old into the Michigan woods at gunpoint. His intent was clear. A plea deal followed. He admitted to assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct. Justice was brief. He received a sentence of 5 to 10 years in a state facility. By February 1986, he was free again, having served only the minimum 5 years. Despite his violent record, there was no physical link to Andrea. He remained a free man. The search went national in 1993. Andrea's face reached millions through a screen. Her image appeared alongside other missing children in the Soul Asylum music video for Runaway Train. The screen went dark, but the questions remained. For decades, the case stayed cold. 1998 brought another arrest. Dennis had broken into a colleague's home to steal lingerie. Before the judge, he attempted to weaponize his grief. He wrote a letter claiming to be a devoted father. He spoke of 2 daughters, aged 25 and 11. He painted a picture of domestic harmony. He omitted the most vital fact: his eldest daughter had been gone for 10 years. The court handed down 5 years of probation. The investigation into Andrea remained stagnant. In 2002, Kathy Turkanian began searching for the daughter she had given up. It took 8 years for the truth to reach her. In 2010, she learned Andrea was missing. Kathy's suspicion immediately fell on Dennis. She had heard whispers of the abuse he inflicted. Lacking evidence, she had only a mother's haunting intuition. Andrea's fate remained a dark void. Everything changed in 2019. A separate crime provided the key to this locked door. At 71, Dennis was arrested for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle. The killing occurred in Norfolk, Virginia. DNA had finally caught up with him after 40 years. The genetic profile was undeniable. The timeline of his past crimes began to align. During that 1980 trial, he had vanished for 2 weeks. His excuse was a fabrication. He claimed military obligations required him to attend a summer camp. It was a convenient lie. By February 2020, Dennis sat in a cell. Facing a murder trial, he decided to speak. The silence regarding Andrea finally broke. He sat across from police and confessed. He admitted to the murder of his adoptive daughter. The date was March 11th, 1989. A confrontation had turned lethal. Andrea had threatened to expose his history of sexual abuse. Rage took over. He struck her repeatedly until she fell down the basement stairs. He chose self-preservation over mercy. Fearing a life sentence, he left her to die. He stashed her body in the barn and called the police. He reported her as a runaway. A year later, he moved the evidence. He brought the remains to their new home in Hamilton. Detectives eventually found what was left of her. She was discarded in trash bags inside a barrel. The site was the backyard of his Monterey Township residence. Charges were filed in August 2020. He faced counts of first-degree murder, child abuse, and the mutilation of a human body. The skeletal remains told a violent story. The autopsy confirmed both sharp and blunt force trauma. A sharp-edged instrument had been used on the child. The mutilation was calculated. Confronted with the forensic reality, Dennis surrendered the final details. He used a cardboard barrel. When she wouldn't fit, he used a machete and an axe. He forced her into the container. The killer partitioned the remains into 4 separate bags, concealing them beneath his own soil for a full year before disturbing the grave. These fragments were then transported and reinterred at his new residence in Hamilton on December 22, 2021. At the time, Dennis, who was already incarcerated for life regarding the Kathleen Doyle homicide, offered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder involving the killing of Andrea Bowman. On February 7, 2022, the court handed down a consecutive sentence of 35 to 50 years for her death. November 13, 1983. Delray Beach authorities were summoned after a passing motorcyclist made a grim discovery. A woman's body lay discarded near an Amtrak station. Arriving at approximately 7 to 10 in the morning, investigators surveyed the area. Within the 1700 block of Depot Avenue in Broward County, Florida, they encountered the battered, still form of a young victim. She was a white female, likely in her early 20s, with hair the color of rust. A knife remained abandoned in the vicinity of the scene. Police hypothesized she had been standing on the platform, awaiting her train when an assailant struck. She had been subjected to a severe beating, resulting in death, followed by the calculated impact of a vehicle. For several hours, detectives combed the perimeter and questioned those nearby. Local residents offered no leads, reporting nothing out of the ordinary. The victim was eventually identified as a 21-year-old named Carla Lowe. Born on December 10, 1961, she was remembered by those who knew her as a gentle and altruistic soul who prioritized the needs of others. She maintained an exceptionally tight bond with her relatives. Even in her youth, this protective instinct was evident as she frequently watched over her sister's offspring during work hours. Her inclination to assist was constant. On the final day of her life, she had dedicated more than 60 minutes to aiding a stranded motorist. In 1983, Carla was a resident of Pompano Beach, Florida. The news of her violent end shattered her family, leaving them to mourn the loss of their cherished Carla. The trauma inflicted upon her was so extensive that an open casket was impossible. Her loved ones sought only the opportunity to face the individual who stole her life. Yet, for the authorities, the identity of the perpetrator remained an enigma. The trail was thin. Further inquiry revealed that Carla's final interaction had been a phone call with a trusted associate. It also surfaced that her younger sibling, Jacqueline, who was only 18 then, had intended to accompany her that morning. A last-minute change of heart left Carla to travel toward her fate, entirely alone. Her 1963 Mercury Comet was later discovered within the 1100 block of West Atlantic Avenue on the very afternoon her remains were located. The immediate environment offered little in the way of forensic leads or suspect profiles. Silence followed, as no witnesses emerged. The medical examiner subsequently determined the official cause of death to be blunt force trauma. Beyond this clinical fact, there was a profound lack of intelligence. Deprived of momentum, the file grew cold. It would remain untouched for nearly 4 decades. 2005. Detectives revisited the evidence, submitting the recovered knife for DNA analysis, hoping for a trace of the killer. The testing proved inconclusive. Once more, the investigation drifted into stagnation. A shift occurred in 2021 when fresh evidence surfaced. That year, cold case detective Todd Clancy assumed the lead, promptly reactivating the search for answers. He consulted with the original investigators who handled the 1983 scene, seeking lost perspective. With traditional avenues depleted, Detective Clancy turned toward advanced forensic technology provided by a British firm, Foster and Freeman. Their specialized recover system utilizes chemical vapor fuming to manifest latent fingerprints on challenging materials, including those subjected to high temperatures, such as discharged ammunition casings, or objects scrubbed clean to evade detection. Leveraging this innovation, investigators successfully lifted a print, though the specific source remains confidential. This mark was traced to 59-year-old Ralph Williams, a lifelong Florida man. Decades earlier, on the day Carla's body was found in 1983, police had taken Ralph into custody for separate counts of vehicle theft and burglary. Yet, he was no stranger to the Lowe investigation. He had previously been scrutinized regarding her death in connection to the crime after fellow prisoners informed authorities of his alleged admission to the killing. During a prior search of his residence, police had recovered a mass of blood-stained auburn hair, but stunningly, this evidence was insufficient for a definitive forensic link. Lacking corroboration, formal charges remained out of reach, forcing the file back into hibernation. Ralph's documented history of violence includes over 20 arrests within the state, spanning offenses from burglary and violent resistance to armed robbery. The criminal record listed the illegal sale and distribution of heroin and marijuana, alongside the possession of tools for burglary. On November 30th, 2021, authorities arrived at Ralph Williams' Jacksonville, Florida home. He was arrested for the murder of Carla Lowe. Investigative teams found no prior connection between Williams and his victim. There was no apparent motive for the killing. Some of the victim's personal property had been taken. After Williams spent 1 full year in county jail, the legal landscape shifted in late 2022. That November, the state prosecution offered a plea agreement. Initially, Williams refused the deal. He cited a lack of confidence in his public defenders and intended to secure private legal counsel. Shortly after, his perspective changed. This shift in strategy led him to accept the negotiated settlement. Under the specific conditions of the agreement, he entered a formal plea. He pleaded to the reduced charge of manslaughter while armed. The court handed down a sentence of 1 year in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. Since he had already remained in custody for 12 months, he received full credit for time served. He was released immediately. For the family of Carla Lowe, this resolution was a bitter blow. They watched as a man accused of murder walked away. Carla's sister, Jacqueline Lowe Rapists, spoke with heavy conviction. It was not justice. She articulated the profound disappointment felt by the entire family. The relatives had been hesitant to accept any plea from the beginning. However, they understood the evidentiary hurdles the prosecution faced. They chose to accept the reality of the court's decision. Decades earlier, between 1990 and 1999, a different shadow fell over Myers Park. This wealthy Charlotte, North Carolina enclave was gripped by terror. A serial predator had begun targeting young girls across the region. The sequence of violence began on June 13, 1990. Deputies were called to a residence on Maryland Avenue to investigate a home invasion. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department responded to the scene. They did not yet realize they were standing at the threshold of a 10-year manhunt. This case would mark the start of endless sleepless nights for the residents. For the detectives involved, it was the beginning of a pursuit for an invisible assailant. The victim was a teenager, She told authorities that a man had breached the security of her home to commit a sexual assault. She was unable to provide a physical description of the man. He had worn a ski mask and took calculated steps to avoid leaving forensic evidence behind. The predator was disciplined, leaving the police with no DNA and no face to put on a poster. The investigation stalled before it could truly begin. While detectives searched for a lead, the silence was broken by another report. A similar assault occurred in the same district, only a few miles from the first. The signature of the crimes was unmistakable. This was not an isolated incident. It was the opening act of a serial offender. A shadow fell over the neighborhood for 9 years. The predator terrorized the Myers Park community. 15 young girls were targeted in a series of sexual assaults. The final report came on January 9, 1999, from Highview Road. Of the 15 victims, the eldest was 18. The youngest was only 3 years old. The assaults followed a rigid, disturbing pattern. The methods were specific, unique. Authorities determined a single individual was responsible. It was a lone predator, yet the trail of physical evidence remained frustratingly thin. Early leads offered only a vague silhouette. The attacker stood between 5'2" and 5'4". He was likely between 20 and 30 years old with a muscular frame. He hid behind a dark ski mask and gloves. He favored dark jackets and trousers. His actual heritage remained a mystery to the investigators. Accounts were inconsistent. Some survivors described him as Hispanic, while others believed he was Caucasian. Typically, he was armed with a knife. He would breach a home and take the child to a secondary location for the assault. None were killed. Each was eventually discarded and left to survive. By the end of 1999, the violence ceased. The perpetrator vanished before the police could close in. Detectives speculated on his disappearance. Perhaps he moved, was jailed for other crimes, or had died. There were no definitive answers. By then, the press had labeled him the Myers Park Rapist. Law enforcement refused to abandon the file. They committed thousands of hours to the search. Names were crossed off lists for years. No one could be linked definitively to the crimes. Time caused the momentum to fade. Eventually, only a skeleton crew kept the investigation breathing. The trail went cold until 2006. That year, the search for the predator reignited. A dedicated cold case unit was established. Their mission was to resolve every unsolved sexual assault in the region. This specific series of crimes became their immediate focus. It was their primary objective. Sergeant Daryl Price, a veteran investigator, was chosen to command the new specialized unit. Forensic technology had finally matured. In one sexual assault file, investigators recovered genetic material from secondary items once thought useless. During the 1990s, forensic evidence kits were restricted to blood-type serology. This science focused on the analysis of blood serums to identify biological markers. These examinations targeted specific pathogens and immune responses. The goal was to determine if a subject carried a particular disease. The landscape shifted in the 2000s as DNA testing gained momentum. It soon became the primary instrument for dismantling the silence of cold cases. In 2009, authorities apprehended 66-year-old Gilbert McNair. He was a suspect in a string of assaults across Charlotte between 1990 and 1998. The arrest brought a wave of relief. Investigators and the public alike believed they had finally captured the man responsible for the entire reign of terror. McNair used specific break-in techniques that matched 15 different crime scenes. This consistency gave the survivors a fleeting sense that justice was finally within reach. Closure seemed certain in 2011 when the court handed down a 36-year prison sentence. The predator was behind bars, and the case appeared closed. However, the legal victory was incomplete. McNair was only convicted for assaulting 2 women, ages 21 and 28, on Crescent Avenue during the 1990s. A darker truth remained. 13 of the 15 victims were children under the age of 18. It became disturbingly clear that a second predator was still walking free. This unknown assailant was a shadow operating with chilling precision. He wore masks and gloves, ensuring that he left almost no physical trace for the police to follow. For more than a decade, the investigation stalled against a wall of silence. Every lead evaporated, and the suspect remained a ghost in the system. The breakthrough finally arrived after years of patient waiting. New technology allowed investigators to look at the evidence through a modern molecular lens. In 2019, technicians successfully developed a genetic profile from DNA preserved at the crime scenes. Yet, the national database offered no immediate answers. When the profile was uploaded to the system in December 2021, there was no match. The investigation required a more sophisticated approach to identify the source. Using a specialized grant and forensic genetic genealogy, police began a deep dive into ancestral records. They finally narrowed their focus to a single individual. The suspect was identified as David Edward Doran of Charlotte. While he did not reside in Myers Park, he viewed the affluent neighborhood as his personal hunting ground. Doran operated as a nocturnal cat burglar, slipping into homes under the cover of darkness. He specialized in the theft of high-value jewelry and personal valuables. Distant relatives later spoke to the police about his history of theft. However, they claimed to have no knowledge of the violent sexual component of his crimes. Doran was a familiar name in police files. In 2001, he was convicted for possessing burglary tools, signaling his commitment to a life of crime. His record included various traffic violations and a charge for assault inflicting serious injury. However, he walked away with a not guilty verdict in 2004. A felony bribery charge followed in 2005, which was eventually dismissed. He continued to navigate the legal system without leaving a permanent mark. Crucially, his DNA was never entered into the national database during these encounters. He remained a ghost to investigators until genetic genealogy finally unmasked him. Now, law enforcement agencies across the country are reconsidering his history. They speculate Doran may be tied to as many as 50 different assaults nationwide. His transient lifestyle took him through California, Texas, and Ohio. Wherever he lived, he likely left a trail of trauma that is only now being uncovered. By 1990, the year of the first Charlotte attack, he was 49 years old. This late start suggested a much longer, hidden history of violence. During a press briefing on the identification of the Myers Park predator, Sergeant Darrell Price addressed this psychological timeline directly. Price noted that people don't become a rapist at 49 years old. The sergeant was convinced that Doran's crimes spanned his entire adult life. He will never stand trial for his actions. Doran died on June 24, 2008, at the age of 67, escaping earthly accountability. Police confirmed that had he been alive, the evidence would have been more than sufficient for a full conviction. The case is solved, but the cell remains empty. The department reached out to each survivor to provide the name of their attacker. The reactions were a heavy mix of relief and lingering pain. Sergeant Price observed that the survivors expressed deep gratitude for the truth. On September 26, 1984, the story of Mary McLaughlin began its tragic end. The 58-year-old mother of 11 grown children was spending her evening at the Highland pub. She was known for her love of dominoes and social drinking. The venue, now known as the Duck Club, sat near Mansfield Park in Glasgow. It was a typical night of routine and community for the local residents. Her daughter, Catherine, joined her at the pub for a short time. They shared the evening together before the daughter had to leave for her own home. Catherine boarded a bus, unaware that this would be her final moment with her mother. Mary remained at the pub, continuing her evening in good spirits. At approximately 10:45, Mary began the short walk to her apartment in Partick. The journey was less than a mile, a path she had walked many times. She made a final stop at a chip shop on Dunbarton Road. There, she purchased fritters and cigarettes, engaging in her usual friendly banter with the staff. Mary was described as jovial and laughing, a woman comfortable in her surroundings. As she walked out of the shop, the atmosphere shifted. An employee noticed a man stepping out behind her, following her into the shadows. That glimpse was the final time Mary was seen alive by the public. Concern mounted within the family as the days passed without a word from her. The silence was uncharacteristic and deeply unsettling for her children. On October 6th, 6 days after she vanished, her son Martin Cullen went to her home. He was determined to find answers to his mother's disappearance. He found the doors locked, but a foul, unmistakable odor was seeping from the apartment. His repeated knocks on the door were met only with silence. Martin attempted to use a spare key borrowed from a neighbor, but the lock refused to turn. The situation inside was becoming increasingly grim. Driven by a desperate intuition, Martin finally forced his way into the residence by kicking the door in. Once he crossed the threshold, the horror was revealed. The frame finally splintered. He kicked the door inward. Once inside the residence, inside the apartment, he was met with a horrific scene. His mother's body lay cold and still. She was flat on her back across the bed, a ligature cinched around her throat, and one arm hanging limp. Her legs were spread and her dressing gown was on backward, the belt serving as the murder weapon. Her dentures sat on the floor, discarded in the struggle. Paralyzed by grief, her son called the authorities. Early investigative efforts were frustrated. The police found almost no physical evidence pointing toward a credible suspect. A post-mortem determined that Mary had been strangled roughly 5 days before her body was finally discovered. This timeline indicated that the life was taken from her on the same night she was last seen alive. She bore severe trauma, including a visible ligature mark. In 1984, DNA science did not yet exist. Without digital footprints or surveillance footage, the police in 1984 were forced to rely on traditional methods. Despite gathering hundreds of statements from the community, the Strathclyde investigators were met with a wall of silence. The investigation essentially stopped. For years, the case remained dormant, save for the occasional, unsuccessful cold case review. Evidence was re-examined on 4 separate occasions in 2002, 4, 6, and 8, without a breakthrough. In 2014, a media report revisited Mary McLaughlin's death, eventually triggering a 5th forensic review. This time, the silence was broken. Scientists successfully isolated a genetic profile belonging to an unidentified male. The evidence was recovered from DNA found within a knot tied by the killer on her dressing gown belt. Additional traces were found on the fabric of the gown and on a discarded cigarette butt from the scene. 5 more years would pass before the technology allowed detectives to finally attach a name to the profile. 35 years after the murder in Mary's home, the authorities finally identified the man responsible for the killing. 59-year-old Graham McGill was the culprit. In 1981, aged 20, he was imprisoned for sexual assault. He received a 6-year sentence. However, by 1984, his behavior earned him a spot in a reintegration program. This initiative was designed to prepare violent offenders for their eventual re-entry into society. As part of his program, McGill was granted weekend leave. On his final night of liberty, he met Mary. On that September night in 1984, McGill was a transient presence in an area where he was unknown. He encountered Mary while she was walking home. He chose to exploit her reputation for being kind and trusting. Though half her age, he engaged her in conversation. She allowed the younger man to walk her back home. They arrived at her 3rd-floor apartment. Once inside the flat, the predatory nature of his visit was revealed. He initiated a violent, sexually motivated attack. Mary attempted to fight back against the sudden, overwhelming force. She was no match for her assailant. He strangled her with her own gown and then fled the residence. He locked the door from the outside, leaving her body behind. He successfully evaded law enforcement for 15 years. In 1999, he was sentenced to life for the attempted sexual assault of a 24-year-old woman. He was paroled in 2007. In December 2019, police arrested him at his Glasgow home. McGill appeared disoriented. He likely never expected the past to catch up with him after 35 years. Or, as a career predator, he may have been unsure which of his past victims had finally found him. The DNA was bolstered by a witness. McGill's ex-wife testified that he confessed to a murder in 1988. He reportedly told her he killed because he wanted to know the sensation of taking a human life. She kept this secret for decades, terrified by his threats to murder her if she ever spoke out. Despite the evidence, McGill denies all allegations. Finally, in May 2021, Graham McGill was sentenced to 14 years for the 1984 murder. While the family felt some relief, they were ultimately disappointed at the length of the sentence handed down by the court. They expressed dismay that he was ever released at all. Closure remains a difficult concept for many. It is especially hard for the victims of cold cases and the families left in the wake of tragedy. We hope that they can find some measure of solace through the answers they waited decades to receive. Reflections on this case remind us of the persistence required to find justice in the darkest of circumstances. The legacy of Mary McLaughlin serves as a solemn reminder of a life that deserved far better protection. DNA collected from 100 people and still no match. Nancy Jane Doherty spent her life helping others. She worked at a care home, volunteered as an EMT, and was planning to become a paramedic. On the night of the 15th of July, 1986, she said goodnight to a friend who promised to help her move the next morning. He knocked on her door the next day. She never answered. Nancy was 38 years old. For decades, investigators did everything right. They tested DNA from over 100 individuals. They offered tens of thousands of dollars in rewards. They conducted periodic reviews, reran database comparisons, and followed every lead until there were no leads left to follow. The case went silent, not because people stopped caring, but because the technology simply didn't exist yet to find the answer hiding in the evidence. Then, in 2020, a specialized genetic laboratory finally gave investigators what 34 years of work could not match. Nancy's story is not one of failure. It is a story of relentless human persistence meeting its moment. Every detective who refused to close that file, every dollar spent on rewards, every database comparison that came back empty, all of it mattered. All of it was waiting for science to arrive. And when science arrived, it only took what the investigators had already preserved so carefully. Preparation meets opportunity. That is how cold cases get solved. Nancy deserved better in 1986, but she got justice, and that is something